The morning I realized I couldn't save her, I was standing in my kitchen at 5 a.m., staring at a stack of medical bills I'd already read 40 times. My granddaughter had been diagnosed 8 months earlier, acute myeloid leukemia. She was 11 years old, and she collected ceramic frogs, and she still slept with the same stuffed rabbit she'd had since she was 2. The hospital bills had overtaken the dining room table so completely that we'd stopped eating there. I'd sold my car. I'd taken out a second mortgage on a house that wasn't worth much to begin with. I'd called every assistance program I could find, sat on hold for hours, filled out forms in triplicate, and still the number we needed, $312,000, felt as unreachable as the moon. Her father, my son-in-law, had left when she was 4. My daughter worked 2 jobs and still couldn't keep up. I was 63 years old, retired from 31 years of teaching elementary school, and the most valuable thing I owned was a 1987 upright piano that had belonged to my mother. I was not the kind of woman things happen to. I mean that in the plainest way. I lived quietly, I paid my bills on time, I grew tomatoes in the summer and read library books in the winter, and I had never once in my life done anything that could be described as bold. Which is why when the letter arrived, I almost threw it away without opening it. It came on a Tuesday plain white envelope, my name typed in a font that looked almost old-fashioned. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored paper and a telephone number, and below the number 4 sentences. My name is Aldrich Voss. I am aware of your granddaughter's situation. I have a proposal that may be of mutual benefit. Please call at your earliest convenience. I set it down on the counter. I picked it up again. I read it 4 more times. My first thought was that it was a scam. My second thought was that it didn't matter because I had nothing left to steal. I called the number that evening. The man who answered had a voice like old furniture. Solid, unhurried, a little worn around the edges. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He told me he had a situation that required a solution, and that he believed I might be the appropriate person for that solution, and that if I was willing to meet in person, he would explain everything. When I asked how he knew about my granddaughter, he said only that he had his ways, and that I was under no obligation to be curious about them. I should have hung up. Instead, I said I could meet Thursday. He sent a car. Not a taxi, a car, black and quiet, with a driver who didn't speak beyond good evening and held the door open like I was someone important. We drove 40 minutes out of town into a part of the county I'd never had much reason to visit, where the houses sat far back from the road behind old trees and longer driveways. The house was large but not showy, stone and dark wood, ivy on the north wall. The kind of place that had been standing long enough to stop trying to impress anyone. The driver walked me to the front door and rang the bell and left. A housekeeper let me in, a woman of about 50 with a calm face and sensible shoes, and led me to a study near the back of the house. She offered tea. I said yes because my hands needed something to do. Aldrich Voss was already in the room when I arrived. He was standing at the window with his back to me, and when he turned, my first impression was of a man who had once been very handsome, and now carried that fact the way some people carry an old injury, not quite forgetting it, not quite at peace with it either. He was perhaps 70, silver hair precisely kept, a good suit, and on his hands, both of them, dark leather gloves. In the middle of summer, in a warm room, he didn't offer to shake hands. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk and waited until I was seated before he sat down himself. Old-fashioned manners, the kind my father used to have. He told me his situation plainly, the way I imagine he handled most things. He had a legal matter, an estate dispute with a distant relative who was challenging the terms of his late wife's will. The challenge hinged on a technicality, a clause that granted certain provisions only if he remarried within a 3-year window following her death. The 3 years were nearly up. His lawyers had advised him that contesting the clause would be expensive, uncertain, and unpleasant. The simpler solution they had determined was to fulfill it. He needed a wife, for 1 year, legal, documented, legitimate in every way that mattered on paper. At the end of the year, an amicable divorce, and in exchange, he named the number without flinching, $320,000, paid in full within 2 weeks of the wedding date. I sat very still. He said, "I'm told you were a schoolteacher for 31 years, that you have an impeccable reputation in your community, that you are private, self-sufficient, and not prone to drama." He said those last 2 words with particular emphasis, and I understood that they were the most important items on his list. I asked him what the arrangement would look like, practically speaking. He said I would move into the house for the duration. We would appear together at whatever functions were legally or socially necessary. Beyond that, he said, I would have full use of the East Wing, including a sitting room and a private library. His staff would see to meals and maintenance. He asked nothing from me beyond presence and discretion. I asked why he was telling me about the gloves. He paused. Not long, just a half-second catch, the kind you might miss if you weren't paying attention. Then he said he wasn't telling me anything about them. He was simply noting that he had certain habits of personal privacy that he expected would be respected. I looked at him for a moment. He looked back without apology. I told him I needed 48 hours. He said that was acceptable. I drove home in the same quiet car, and I sat in my kitchen until past midnight, and I thought about my granddaughter sleeping 2 towns over with a port in her chest and ceramic frogs on her windowsill. I thought about my daughter who hadn't slept a full night in 8 months. I thought about the dining room table buried under bills. I called him the next morning and said yes. I moved into the house on a Saturday in late September. The East Wing was nicer than my whole house. The private library had floor-to-ceiling shelves and a window seat and more books than I could read in 10 years, organized not by author or genre but by some system I couldn't immediately decode that turned out, I eventually learned, to be chronological by the date he had acquired them. We established routines quickly and carefully, the way you do when you are 2 strangers sharing a very large space and both pretending that is perfectly normal. I took my breakfast early in the small morning room off the kitchen. He took his later in the dining room. We had dinner together 3 evenings a week. His suggestion, for the sake of appearances with the staff, he said. And those dinners were, for the first month, almost entirely silent. Not unfriendly silence, more like the silence of people who haven't yet decided whether they're going to trust each other. He wore the gloves always, at dinner, at the handful of social obligations we attended together in the hallways of his own home. I noticed, because I am a person who notices things, that he was acutely careful never to set them down where someone might handle them. He kept a spare pair in his jacket pocket. Once, when we were leaving a charity event and he briefly removed his outer coat, I saw him check the gloves first. A small, practiced gesture, entirely unconscious. I didn't ask. He had been clear. I respected the line. What I didn't expect was that I would start looking forward to the dinners. It happened gradually. The silence softened, the way silence does when 2 people spend enough time inside it together. He started asking questions about teaching, about my students, about what 31 years in a classroom does to a person. He listened the way few people actually listen, without planning his next sentence while I was still finishing mine. He remembered things I had mentioned weeks earlier and returned to them quietly, unprompted. I learned that he had built his company from very little, that he had been married for 22 years to a woman named Patricia. I could say the name now without his face closing like a shutter, though it had taken a while, that he had no children and considered this the central grief of his life, stated plainly and not asked to be comforted about. I learned that he played chess badly on purpose against his housekeeper because she enjoyed winning, and that he kept a shortwave radio in his study and sometimes listened to weather broadcasts from other countries late at night just because he found it calming. He was not what I had expected. I wasn't sure what I had expected. Something colder, maybe, more transactional. The gloves remained. A closed door I had agreed not to open until the night in January when everything shifted. I had gotten up at 2 in the morning. I've never been a good sleeper, not since the diagnosis, not since the bills started, and I was heating milk in the kitchen when I heard it, a dull thud from the direction of his study. Then nothing. Then a sound that I can only describe as someone trying very hard not to make any sound at all. I stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. Then I walked down the hall. His study door was half open. He was on the floor near the desk, one hand braced against the leg of his chair, breathing in the deliberate way of a person managing pain. He had fallen, I could see where his foot had caught the corner of the rug, and in catching himself he had knocked a lamp from the desk. And he wasn't wearing the gloves. I didn't say anything immediately. I came into the room and crouched down and put my hand on his shoulder and said, "Steady," in the voice I had used for 31 years with children who had fallen on playgrounds. He tried to pull back, an instinct, automatic. His hands moved toward his jacket, which was draped over the chair, and I understood in that second what he was reaching for. I said, "Don't," not harshly, Just quietly, the way you say don't to someone who's about to do something that will hurt them more than whatever they're afraid of. He went still. In the lamplight from the hallway, I could see his hands clearly for the first time. Both of them. The right was almost normal, a few faint traces of old scarring along the knuckles. But the left was different. The scarring ran from the wrist to the mid-forearm, severe and thorough, the kind that comes from a serious burn and takes years and still doesn't fully resolve. The skin had healed but changed, pulling tight in places, the surface texture completely altered, the kind of hands that people stare at, the kind that a proud private man might spend 70 years hiding. I helped him up. I found the footstool, and we sat, him in his chair, me on the footstool, which was slightly ridiculous given the circumstances, and which I think was why he almost smiled. I didn't ask what had happened. I wasn't going to ask that. I asked if anything was twisted or broken from the fall. He said no. His shoulder, maybe bruised, nothing serious. I told him I'd been a room parent for every grade level between kindergarten and fifth for 20 years running, and that I had seen more injuries than most people assume school teachers see, and that bruised shoulders felt different than broken ones, and his seemed bruised. He looked at me. I looked back. He said, "You're not going to make this into a conversation." I said, "About what?" He was quiet for a moment. Then something changed in his face, not softening exactly, more like a kind of exhaustion giving way. He said it had been a fire, 43 years ago. He had been 27. A warehouse fire at a company he'd just started building. He'd gone back in for a colleague who was trapped, and he'd gotten the colleague out, and he'd gotten himself out too, but not without cost. I said, "The colleague?" He said he'd retired comfortably in Arizona and sent a Christmas card every year. I didn't say anything for a while. Outside, the January wind was working at the windows in that persistent way it does in old houses. Then I said, "You've been hiding something that happened because you were brave." He said he hadn't been hiding it because of that. He'd been hiding it because he had learned at 27 and then many times afterward exactly how people looked at those hands. And he had decided he would rather not spend his life receiving that particular look from every person he met. I thought about that. I thought about the things we carry because we think we have to, the things we wrap up and put away because we can't bear the weight of other people's reactions to them. I said I understood that, not in the soft, meaningless way people say they understand. I said it the way you say it when you actually do. We sat in his study until nearly 4 in the morning. He made tea. I hadn't known he knew how to make tea, but apparently his wife had taught him and he'd kept the habit. We talked about things that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with it. I told him about my granddaughter, really told him, not the polished version I gave to acquaintances, but the real version, with the 5 a.m. bill reading and the ceramic frogs and the way she still called me Gram in this particular voice that no one else would ever use for me. He listened. He asked her name. He asked what her favorite frog looked like. I went to bed at 4:15 and I lay in the dark for a long time and I thought, this is not what I agreed to. But I wasn't sure anymore what I had agreed to. The year moved the way years do when you stop watching them too closely, faster than you expected, and with more inside them than you'd planned for. My granddaughter responded to treatment, not all at once, not without setbacks, but she responded. By April, she was strong enough to video call me from her hospital bed and show me a new ceramic frog her occupational therapist had given her. It was teal, with enormous painted eyes, and by June she was home. By August, she was back in school part-time. I didn't tell him about each small milestone, but somehow he knew when something had shifted, and on those evenings his questions were softer, more careful, like he was offering me space to be relieved without making me perform the relief for anyone. At some point in the spring, the dinners became every evening instead of 3 times a week. Neither of us commented on this. It was simply what happened. He stopped wearing the gloves at dinner. Just at dinner, at first, in the privacy of the dining room with no one but the 2 of us and occasionally the housekeeper, who, I realized eventually, had known about the scars for years and treated them with the same unconcerned practicality she brought to everything else in that house. By summer, he was wearing them less in general. Not gone, he still wore them in public, and I suspected he always would, and that was his to decide, but lighter about it, somehow. Less like armor, more like habit. We were sitting on the back porch one evening in early October, 1 week before the year was up, watching the light go out of the sky over the back fields, and he said, "The lawyers have filed everything. The estate matter is resolved. You've held up your end entirely." I said I was glad. He said the arrangement had been more than he had anticipated. He said it carefully, the way he said most things he cared about. I said I knew what he meant. He said he supposed he was asking whether I had any interest in renegotiating the terms. I was quiet for a moment. In the field at the edge of the property, the last of the season's fireflies were doing their slow work. I told him I had come into this house as a transaction. I told him that was honest and I wasn't ashamed of it, because my granddaughter's life had been worth any transaction I could find. I told him that what I was leaving with was not what I had arrived expecting to carry home. He said he felt similarly. I said then I suppose the answer was yes. He looked at me for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then he looked back at the field, and there was something on his face that I hadn't seen there when I arrived a year ago, something unclenched about it, something that had decided finally to put a few things down. We sat there until it was too dark to see the fireflies anymore. The court date was 3 weeks later. The judge, a small, brisk woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain, reviewed the paperwork with the efficiency of someone who had seen every version of this before. She asked the standard questions. I answered them truthfully because by then the truth was not a complicated thing. She asked me at one point if I understood what I was affirming. I said I did. She looked at me over the reading glasses with the particular look that experienced judges have, evaluating, a little skeptical, not unkind, and she signed the forms. In the hallway outside the courtroom, he offered me his left hand. Not the right, the left, the one he never offered, the one that had been through fire and 43 years of careful concealment. He held it out to me, and I took it, and we walked out of the building into a November afternoon that was colder than it should have been, and bright in the way November sometimes is meant, when the light comes low and sideways and makes everything look a little more significant than it probably is. My granddaughter called that evening from her mother's house. She had been told, in age-appropriate terms, that Graham had a friend she was spending time with. She was curious in the way 11-year-olds are curious, which is to say loudly and without subtlety. She asked if he was nice. I said he was. She asked if he liked frogs. I told her I would find out. When I relayed the question to him later, he was quiet for a moment in the way he sometimes was before saying something he actually meant. Then he said he had never had strong opinions about frogs, but that he was open to being educated on the subject. I told him that was probably the right answer, and it was.